Hello and welcome. This channel explores the fascinating lives of historical figures, uncovering their impact and legacy. Today, we dive into Boleyn and Anne of Cleves, two queens whose stories shaped England's future. Join us as we uncover their journeys, challenges, and lasting influence. The Queen Who Changed Everything, Anne Boleyn's impact on Anne of Cleves and England's future. Part 1. The Rise of Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn's story did not begin in the halls of power, but it ended up reshaping the course of English history forever. She was born into the ambitious Boleyn family, a lineage of rising courtiers who understood that proximity to the throne could transform fortunes. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a shrewd diplomat, and her mother, Elizabeth Howard, came from noble stock. From an early age, Anne was exposed to the world of European courts, receiving an education that was far beyond what most women of her time could expect. This early exposure gave her not just refinement, but an understanding of politics, power, and persuasion, skills that would serve her well, and ultimately lead to her tragic downfall. As a young girl, Anne was sent to the Netherlands and later to the French court, where she became a lady-in-waiting to Queen Claude of France. These years in France shaped her mind and manner, immersing her in Renaissance culture, courtly etiquette, and the early ideas of religious reform that were sweeping across Europe. Unlike many English ladies who were raised with traditional expectations, Anne learned the power of intelligence, charm, and strategy. She was fluent in French, skilled in music and dance, and possessed a wit that made her stand out in any gathering. She was not just beautiful, though accounts suggest she had striking dark eyes and an alluring presence, but she was also enigmatic, an unpredictable force in a world where women were expected to be passive. When Anne returned to England in the 1520s, she entered the court of Henry VIII as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. At this time, her sister, Mary Boleyn, had already been the king's mistress, but Anne had no intention of being just another passing affair. She was different from the other women at court, sharp-tongued, independent, and unwilling to be controlled. When Henry's attention turned to her, she did something almost unheard of: she refused him. For a king who was used to taking what he wanted, Anne's refusal only made him more determined. She insisted she would not be his mistress but only his wife, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic political and religious upheavals in England's history. Henry, captivated by her, began a relentless pursuit that lasted for years, but there was one major problem: he was already married to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine had been his wife for nearly 2 decades and was beloved by the people, but she had failed to provide him with a living male heir. Anne's presence intensified Henry's desperation for a son, making him even more convinced that his marriage to Catherine was invalid in the eyes of God. He sought an annulment from the Pope, but the Catholic Church, unwilling to anger Catherine's powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V, refused his request. This impasse led Henry to take the most radical step of his reign. He broke from Rome, declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and granted himself the annulment he desired. By 1533, Anne was crowned queen, but her triumph came at a great cost. The marriage of Henry and Anne was not just a personal union, it was a political statement. She was seen as the symbol of England's break with Rome, and her influence extended far beyond the king's affection. Anne was an advocate of religious reform, supporting scholars who translated the Bible into English and encouraging Henry to move further from traditional Catholic practices. She surrounded herself with Protestant thinkers, making her a dangerous figure to those who remained loyal to the old faith. However, being queen did not bring the security Anne had hoped for. Her greatest duty was to produce a male heir, but in 1533, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Though Henry was initially hopeful that a son would follow, and suffered several miscarriages, and with each loss, her position grew weaker. Henry, once passionately devoted to her, began to grow disillusioned, his wandering eye settling on one of her own ladies-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. Anne's enemies at court saw an opportunity to remove her. They accused her of adultery, incest, and treason, fabricating evidence to ensure her downfall. In May 1536, she was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, where she would spend her final days. On May 19th, she was executed by a French swordsman, meeting her fate with remarkable composure. She was just 35 years old. Anne's rise and fall were swift, but her impact was permanent. She had changed England in ways no one could have predicted. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would later become one of the greatest monarchs in history, proving that Anne's influence did not die with her. The course of English religion and politics had been forever altered by her ambition, intelligence, and unyielding belief in her own destiny. Part 2. The Fall of Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn had reached the height of power, but power in Henry VIII's court was never secure. The very ambition and intelligence that had made her queen also made her vulnerable, for she had gained many enemies among those who resented her rise. Her marriage to Henry had been born out of passion and defiance, but the same man who had broken with the Catholic Church to have her would just as easily discard her when she failed to meet his expectations. Anne's greatest failure in Henry's eyes was her inability to provide him with a male heir. Their first child, Elizabeth, was a disappointment to the king, though he initially reassured Anne that sons would follow. However, as the years passed, Anne suffered a series of miscarriages, each one weakening her position. The loss of a male child in 1536, which some sources suggest was a stillborn son, was the final blow. Henry, who had once moved heaven and earth to have and now saw her as a burden. By this time, Henry's affections had already shifted toward Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. Jane was everything and was not, mild, submissive, and careful not to challenge the king. Where Anne had been bold and politically involved, Jane remained quiet and obedient, appealing to Henry's desire for a more traditional wife. His growing affection for Jane only worsened Anne's situation, as it gave her enemies the perfect opportunity to destroy her. Among those who despised Anne was Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister. Ironically, Cromwell had once been one of Anne's key allies in securing her marriage to Henry, but they had since clashed over religious policies and the distribution of wealth from dissolved monasteries. Anne wanted the money to go toward charitable causes, while Cromwell sought to use it to strengthen the crown's finances. Their conflict made Cromwell realize that Anne was no longer useful to him, and that her removal could strengthen his own position. It is believed that Cromwell orchestrated the conspiracy against Anne, feeding Henry's growing doubts and using the king's disappointment to set a trap. In April 1536, rumors began circulating that Anne was unfaithful, a claim that, if proven, would not only justify an annulment but also allow Henry to rid himself of her completely. A formal investigation was launched, and soon, several men, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, were accused of being her lovers. The charges against Anne were shocking and sensational. She was accused of adultery with multiple men, including her musician Mark Smeaton, courtiers Henry Norris and William Brereton, and even her own brother, George. These accusations were almost certainly fabricated, as there was little evidence beyond forced confessions and court gossip. However, in Henry's court, once the king believed something to be true, or wanted it to be true, evidence was of little consequence. Anne was arrested on May 2, 1536, and taken to the Tower of London. She was in disbelief, unable to comprehend how she had fallen so quickly from favor. Just 3 years earlier, she had been crowned queen in a grand ceremony, and now she was locked away, awaiting trial for crimes she had not committed. Her trial took place on May 15th, and it was clear from the beginning that the outcome had already been decided. The jury was made up of her enemies, including her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who presided over the proceedings. Anne defended herself with intelligence and dignity, but it made no difference. She was found guilty of treason, adultery, and incest, and the sentence was death. The men accused alongside her were also condemned, and on May 17th, they were executed. Anne, meanwhile, was granted a small mercy, rather than being burned at the stake, as was customary for a queen accused of treason, she would be beheaded with a sword, a method considered more humane. On the morning of May 19th, and dressed with great care, determined to meet her fate with dignity, she walked to the scaffold at the Tower Green, where a small crowd had gathered to witness her execution. In her final speech, she did not admit guilt, but neither did she protest her innocence too strongly, perhaps understanding that defying Henry's will would only bring more suffering to those she left behind. Instead, she praised the king and accepted her fate, her words carefully chosen to ensure that her family would not be punished further. She knelt before the executioner, and with a single swift stroke of the sword, her life was ended. Her body was placed in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the Tower of London, where she remains to this day. And Boleyn's fall was as dramatic as her rise. In the span of a few short years, she had gone from being the most powerful woman in England to a condemned traitor. But while Henry and his court moved on, Anne's legacy was far from over. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would grow up to become one of the most formidable rulers in history, proving that Anne's influence endured beyond the grave. Part 3. Henry VIII's subsequent marriages. Anne Boleyn was gone, but her shadow lingered over Henry VIII's court. Her execution in May 1536 cleared the way for Jane Seymour, the woman who had so carefully positioned herself as the opposite of and Weir and had been outspoken and politically engaged. Jane was quiet and obedient, a perfect embodiment of the Tudor ideal of womanhood. Henry wasted no time in marrying her. Just 11 days after Anne's execution, Jane Seymour became the new Queen of England. Jane's tenure as queen was short but significant. Unlike Anne, who had been under immense pressure to give Henry a son and had ultimately failed, Jane succeeded where her predecessor had not. In October 1537, she gave birth to the long-awaited male heir, Prince Edward. The birth of Edward was a moment of triumph, both for Jane and for Henry, who finally had the legitimate son he had fought for so many years to obtain. But the joy was short-lived. Jane died just 12 days later from complications related to childbirth, leaving Henry heartbroken. Jane's death created a dilemma. Henry, now in his late 40s, was still in need of a wife. Though he had his heir, the boy was young and vulnerable, and Henry believed he needed more sons to secure the Tudor dynasty. With Jane's passing, Henry found himself once again searching for a new queen, a process that would be shaped by Anne Boleyn's legacy in more ways than one. By this time, Henry's court had changed significantly. The break with Rome had altered the religious and political landscape of England, and Anne's influence in these matters could not be ignored. Many of the policies she had championed, the spread of Protestantism, the weakening of papal authority, were now permanent fixtures of Henry's reign. His next marriage would be dictated not just by personal desire but by political necessity. It was Thomas Cromwell, the same man who had orchestrated Anne Boleyn's downfall, who now took charge of arranging Henry's fourth marriage. England needed allies, particularly among the Protestant states of Europe, and Cromwell saw an opportunity in the German duchy of Cleves. The ruling family of Cleves was Protestant, making them natural allies against the Catholic powers of France and Spain. With this in mind, Cromwell arranged a marriage between Henry and Anne of Cleves. Anne of Cleves was nothing like Henry's previous wives. She was not raised in the refined courts of France or England, nor was she particularly well versed in the customs and expectations of the Tudor court. She had been brought up in the more modest, practical traditions of the German aristocracy, with little emphasis on courtly flirtation or political maneuvering. When Henry first saw her portrait, painted by the famous artist Hans Holbein, he was intrigued. But when they finally met in person, everything changed. Henry was instantly disappointed. Unlike the elegant, charming Anne Boleyn or the demure Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves did not possess the sophisticated wit or beauty that Henry expected in a queen. Whether this was due to her actual appearance or simply Henry's unrealistic expectations remains a subject of debate. What is certain is that Henry took an immediate dislike to her and became determined to end the marriage before it even truly began. Despite his personal feelings, the marriage went forward in January 1540, but it was doomed from the start. Henry found Anne dull and unappealing, and their union was never consummated. Within 6 months, he sought an annulment, claiming that Anne's previous engagement to another nobleman had made the marriage invalid. And, understanding the precarious nature of her situation, did not fight the annulment. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who had resisted Henry's attempts to remove her, Anne of Cleves complied without protest, securing a generous settlement in exchange for stepping aside. With the annulment finalized, Anne of Cleves was given the title of the King's beloved sister and allowed to remain in England, where she lived comfortably for the rest of her life. She had learned from Anne Boleyn's fate. Defying Henry VIII could be deadly, but submission could ensure survival. With Anne of Cleves out of the way, Henry quickly moved on to his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, a young and vivacious cousin of Anne Boleyn. Catherine's charm and flirtatious nature captivated Henry, who saw in her a chance to recapture his youth. But Catherine's story would end even more tragically than Anne Boleyn's. Accused of adultery, she was arrested and executed in 1542, marking yet another brutal downfall of a queen. By the time Henry married his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, he was a broken man, physically ailing, politically isolated, and haunted by the ghosts of his past wives. Catherine Parr was different from the women who came before her. She was intelligent and well-educated, but she had no ambitions to challenge Henry or his court. Instead, she played the role of a caretaker, ensuring the stability of the royal family and helping to mend the fractures caused by Henry's previous marriages. Through all these marriages, Anne Boleyn's impact remained undeniable. It was Anne who had transformed England by forcing Henry to break from Rome, and who had introduced the ideas of religious reform that would shape England's future, and Anne whose daughter Elizabeth would one day rule as one of England's greatest monarchs. Even as Henry continued to marry and discard wives, Anne's legacy endured. Her influence still felt in the decisions he made and the policies that shaped his reign. Part 4. The Search for a New Wife. Henry VIII's search for a wife was never just about love, it was about power, legacy, and survival. His marriage to Anne Boleyn had cost England its ties to the Catholic Church and had redefined the country's religious and political landscape. After Anne's execution, Henry's desperate need for a male heir drove his marriage to Jane Seymour, whose short-lived triumph was overshadowed by her death after giving birth to Edward. Now, with Anne of Cleves, the search for a new wife had turned into a humiliating miscalculation. Anne of Cleves had been a political match, orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell to secure an alliance with the Protestant states of Germany. But Henry had found her so unappealing that he sought an annulment within months of their wedding. The failure of this marriage did not just end in a quiet separation, it led to Cromwell's downfall. Henry, furious over being trapped in a marriage he detested, blamed Cromwell for deceiving him. In July 1540, just months after arranging the annulment, Cromwell was arrested and executed on Henry's orders. With Cromwell gone, Henry was once again free to make his own choice, and this time, he sought a woman who would restore his youth and passion. His eyes settled on Catherine Howard, a young, vibrant lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves. Catherine was everything and was not, flirtatious, energetic, and eager to please. She was also the cousin of Anne Boleyn, a connection that many at court saw as both ironic and ominous. Catherine's rise was swift. In July 1540, just days after Cromwell's execution, she became Henry's fifth wife. She was no more than 17, while Henry was nearing 50, overweight, and suffering from a variety of ailments. To Henry, Catherine represented the youth and passion he had lost, a chance to recapture the days when he had first fallen in love with Anne Boleyn. But the court knew that this marriage, like the ones before it, was built on unstable ground. At first, Catherine seemed to bring new life to Henry. He showered her with gifts and affection, calling her his rose without a thorn. Unlike Anne of Cleves, who had been an embarrassment to him, Catherine was a prize, an English rose who brightened his aging court. But beneath the surface, danger was already brewing. Catherine had a past, one that was dangerously entangled with the court secrets. Before she became queen, she had been involved in romantic affairs, something that could be dismissed for an ordinary court lady but was a fatal risk for a queen. Worse, rumors began to swirl that she had continued these affairs even after her marriage to Henry. By 1541, Henry's court was filled with whispers. Catherine's past relationships with men like Francis Dereham and her suspected involvement with Thomas Culpeper, a favored courtier, became the subject of intense scrutiny. The idea that Henry, the all-powerful Tudor king, might be betrayed by his young wife sent shockwaves through the court. When Henry was presented with evidence that Catherine had been unfaithful, his reaction was swift and brutal. Catherine was arrested in November 1541 and placed under house arrest at Sion Abbey. She was terrified, desperate to plead her case, but there was no room for forgiveness. In February 1542, she was taken to the Tower of London. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who had faced her death with dignity and composure, Catherine was hysterical, screaming and begging for mercy. But mercy was not in Henry's nature. On February 13th, she was executed, barely in her 20s. With Catherine's death, Henry had now lost 5 wives, 2 to execution, 2 to annulment, and 1 to childbirth. His court had become a place of fear, where marriage to the king was as much a death sentence as it was a privilege. Yet despite the horrors of Catherine's downfall, Henry still believed he needed another wife. The search resumed, but this time, Henry chose carefully. He needed a woman who would not challenge him, one who would be a companion in his final years rather than a threat. He found her in Catherine Parr, an intelligent and experienced widow who had already survived 2 husbands. Unlike his previous wives, Catherine Parr had no ambition to be a great queen, she simply wanted to survive. Catherine Parr married Henry in 1543, and though their marriage lacked the passion of his earlier relationships, it provided stability. She cared for him as his health declined, tending to his ulcers and managing the royal household. But even she was not immune to the dangers of being Henry's wife. Her interest in religious reform nearly led to her arrest in 1546 when conservative factions at court accused her of heresy. Only through careful persuasion and a well-timed apology did she manage to escape the fate of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. By the time Henry died in 1547, he had left behind a court scarred by the consequences of his marriages. His desperate search for a wife who could give him a male heir had shaped England's religious transformation, destroyed families, and left behind a legacy of fear. Yet through all the turmoil, one truth remained: the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth, had survived. Though Henry had once dismissed her in favor of his son Edward, the future would prove that Anne's child would be the one to truly change England forever. Part 5. Anne of Cleves and the Unexpected Legacy. Anne of Cleves arrived in England expecting to become a queen, but she left Henry VIII's marriage bed as something far rarer, one of the few women who had survived him. Unlike her predecessors, Anne never experienced the dangers of childbirth, nor did she face the deadly intrigue that had claimed the lives of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Instead, she became something unique in Tudor history: the king's beloved sister, a title that offered her wealth, independence, and most importantly, safety. Anne's marriage to Henry had been a political arrangement, carefully designed by Thomas Cromwell to secure an alliance with Protestant German states. But Henry's immediate distaste for and sealed the marriage's fate before it even began. When they finally met in person, Henry famously declared that he liked her not. Whether this was due to Anne's appearance, her mannerisms, or simply Henry's own unrealistic expectations remains debated, but the result was the same: he wanted out. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who had fought to maintain her position, Anne of Cleves understood the dangers of resisting Henry's will. When he sought an annulment, she wisely agreed without hesitation. In return, she was given one of the most generous settlements of any discarded queen. She received a vast income, multiple estates, and was treated with more kindness than any of Henry's former wives. Instead of being sent to a convent or facing execution, she was allowed to live freely, a rare privilege in Henry's court. Though she was no longer queen, Anne of Cleves remained in England, a quiet observer of the drama that unfolded in Henry's later years. She witnessed the rise and fall of Catherine Howard, whose tragic fate only reinforced the wisdom of Anne's decision to submit to Henry's wishes. She saw Henry's health decline, his court grow more unstable, and his desperate attempts to secure his legacy through yet another marriage. Through it all, she remained unscathed, a quiet survivor in a world where so many had perished. Despite her new status, Anne's position was not without challenges. She was a foreigner in England, unfamiliar with the court's customs and the shifting alliances that determined one's fate. Though she had been given wealth and security, she had no real power. Her survival depended on maintaining a careful balance, remaining friendly with Henry while never appearing to be a threat. After Henry's death in 1547, Anne's position became even more precarious. The new king, Edward VI, was still a child, and the court was dominated by ambitious nobles vying for control. Anne had no political influence, nor did she have any role in Edward's government. Instead, she withdrew from court life, choosing to live quietly on her estates. Her survival became even more remarkable during the reign of Mary I, Henry's eldest daughter. As a Catholic queen, Mary reversed many of the Protestant policies that had defined her father's reign. This put Anne, a Protestant from a German duchy, in a potentially dangerous position. Yet, once again, she managed to navigate the shifting tides of Tudor politics without falling victim to them. Despite her careful neutrality, Anne's later years were not without hardship. The generous income she had once received began to dwindle as new rulers saw little reason to continue rewarding her. She remained unmarried, despite some speculation that she might remarry after Henry's death. But Anne never sought to reclaim a royal position. She had learned from her brief and disastrous marriage that power in Henry's court was a dangerous illusion. Anne of Cleves died on July 16, 1557, at the age of 41, outliving Henry and 4 of his other wives. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, a final acknowledgement of the unique place she held in Tudor history. Unlike Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard, who had been condemned as traitors, Anne of Cleves was remembered with dignity and respect. Her legacy, however, was not just one of survival, it was also a lesson in adaptation. She had entered England as a foreign bride, only to be rejected and discarded. Yet, rather than fight a battle she could not win, she embraced her new role and thrived where so many others had perished. Her ability to navigate the dangers of Henry's court without making enemies or drawing suspicion allowed her to live longer than almost anyone else in his inner circle. In many ways, Anne of Cleves represented the turning point in Henry's marriages. Her failed union led to the downfall of Thomas Cromwell, shifting the balance of power in Henry's court. Her quiet presence in England was a stark contrast to the turmoil that followed her departure as queen, Catherine Howard's downfall, Henry's declining health, and the increasing instability of the Tudor dynasty. And, in an unexpected way, Anne's story stood as a counterpoint to Anne Boleyn's. Where one had fought to remain queen and paid the ultimate price, the other had walked away and found safety. Though she never bore Henry's children and had little influence on England's politics, Anne of Cleves left behind a legacy that was surprisingly impactful. She demonstrated that survival in Henry's world was not about power, beauty, or ambition. It was about knowing when to step aside, when to accept fate, and when to simply disappear from the dangerous stage of court life. Part 6. Anne Boleyn's enduring influence on England. Anne Boleyn's execution was meant to erase her from history, but instead, it ensured her legacy would shape England for generations. Though she was dead, her influence continued to ripple through the Tudor court, affecting not only Henry VIII's later marriages but also the very foundations of English religion, politics, and monarchy. Her downfall was brutal, yet in the end, it was, and not Henry's other queens, who would have the last word through her daughter, Elizabeth I. At the time of Anne's execution in 1536, her enemies believed they had successfully destroyed her reputation. She was condemned as a traitor, a seductress, and an adulteress, her name meant to be spoken with disgrace. Yet within just a few years, the reforms she had championed, the break from Rome, the rise of Protestantism, and the strengthening of the English monarchy, became permanent parts of England's identity. One of the clearest ways Anne's influence endured was through the English Reformation. While Henry's initial break from Rome had been motivated by his desire to marry, and it had set into motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the full establishment of Protestantism in England, and had been a strong supporter of religious reform, encouraging Henry to read texts that challenged papal authority and aligning herself with the growing Protestant movement. Though Henry remained religiously conservative in many ways, the seeds of Protestantism had already been planted. After Henry's death in 1547, these religious shifts only accelerated. Under Edward VI, Anne's vision of a Protestant England came closer to reality, with radical reforms dismantling Catholic traditions. Even when Mary I attempted to restore Catholicism during her reign, the changes Anne had helped initiate could not be undone. By the time Elizabeth I took the throne in 1558, Protestantism had become firmly embedded in England's national identity. But Anne's influence was not just religious, it was also deeply political. She had redefined what it meant to be queen, proving that a woman could hold power and play an active role in shaping the direction of the kingdom. Unlike Henry's other wives, Anne was not content to be a passive consort. She involved herself in state affairs, forged alliances, and supported reformers who shared her vision. This set a precedent that later queens, especially Elizabeth, would follow. Elizabeth I's reign was, in many ways, the fulfillment of Anne Boleyn's ambitions. Though Anne had died before seeing her daughter's rise to power, Elizabeth embodied her mother's intelligence, strength, and political acumen. As queen, Elizabeth ruled independently, proving that a woman could govern just as effectively as any king. She embraced the Protestant legacy her mother had helped establish, ensuring that England would never again submit to papal authority. Yet, despite her eventual triumph, Elizabeth's early life was deeply shaped by the shadow of her mother's downfall. After Anne's execution, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate, removed from the line of succession, and left in a politically precarious position. Throughout Henry's remaining years, Elizabeth's status fluctuated, depending on Henry's shifting affections for his various wives. It was not until later, under Edward VI and eventually Elizabeth's own reign, that Anne's legacy was reclaimed and honored. Anne's influence extended beyond her daughter. She also shaped the very way English queens were perceived. Before Anne, queens were expected to be quiet, obedient, and uncontroversial. But Anne had shattered this mold, proving that a queen could be a political force in her own right. Though this ultimately led to her downfall, it also set the stage for later queens to wield power in ways that had never been seen before. Even Henry, despite executing Anne, could never truly escape her influence. Many of his later marriages were shaped by comparisons to Anne. Jane Seymour, for example, was carefully positioned as Anne's opposite, meek and submissive, the perfect contrast to Anne's fiery nature. Catherine Howard, Anne's young cousin, was seen as a chance for Henry to recapture the excitement of his early relationship with Anne, though her tragic fate only reinforced the dangers of courtly ambition. Even Anne of Cleves, despite being an entirely different type of woman, was judged in relation to Anne. Henry's rejection of her was in part because she failed to meet the standard of beauty and charm he had once found in Anne Boleyn. Anne's legacy was also preserved in the cultural memory of England. Her story became the subject of countless poems, plays, and historical writings, some portraying her as a tragic victim, others as a cunning seductress who met a deserved end. But as time passed, the image of Anne as a martyr and a reformer grew stronger, particularly during Elizabeth's reign. Under Elizabeth, Anne was quietly rehabilitated, not openly celebrated, but no longer spoken of as a disgraced queen. Instead, she was acknowledged as the mother of England's greatest ruler. Even centuries later, Anne's impact continues to be studied, debated, and reinterpreted. Historians have examined her life from every angle, trying to understand the woman who changed the course of English history. Was she a scheming social climber, or a reformist with a genuine vision for England's future? Was she the victim of a vindictive king, or a woman who played the game of power and lost? The truth is likely a combination of all these perspectives. Regardless of how one interprets her, one fact remains undeniable: Anne Boleyn's influence on England did not end with her death. She reshaped the monarchy, contributed to the religious transformation of the country, and most importantly, left behind a daughter who would become one of the most powerful rulers in English history. In the end, it was, and not Henry, who truly changed everything. Part 7. The parallels between Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves. At first glance, Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves could not have been more different. One was a bold, politically astute woman who captivated Henry VIII with her intelligence and charm, while the other was a reserved, foreign princess whose marriage to Henry ended almost before it began. Yet, despite their differences, their stories intertwined in ways that shaped England's history. Both women entered Henry's life at pivotal moments, both were central to political upheavals, and both left lasting marks on the Tudor dynasty, even if their paths diverged drastically in the end. The first striking parallel between Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves was the way each marriage reshaped Henry's court. When Anne Boleyn rose to prominence, she became the catalyst for England's break from Rome. Henry's obsessive desire to marry her led to the English Reformation, a seismic shift that severed England's ties with the Catholic Church. Anne's marriage was not just a union between two individuals, it was a revolution that upended centuries of religious tradition and political alliances. Anne of Cleves, though she never had the same personal influence over Henry, was equally pivotal in altering the course of Tudor politics. Her marriage was arranged as part of a grand diplomatic strategy, meant to forge an alliance with the Protestant German states. But its failure had just as profound consequences as Anne Boleyn's rise. The annulment of Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves led directly to the downfall of Thomas Cromwell, the architect of the match. His execution marked a turning point in Henry's later reign, shifting power back toward conservative factions that opposed the religious reforms Cromwell and Anne Boleyn had championed. Another key similarity between the two Annes was their role in shaping Henry's later relationships. Anne Boleyn had set a precedent for queens who challenged the traditional role of a Tudor consort. She was opinionated, politically engaged, and fiercely independent, all qualities that ultimately contributed to her downfall. After Anne, Henry's expectations for his wives were shaped by both his admiration and his resentment toward her. Anne of Cleves, on the other hand, represented something entirely different: the lesson of how to survive Henry VIII. Where Anne Boleyn had fought to maintain her status as queen, Anne of Cleves took the opposite approach. She surrendered, and in doing so, she secured a life of safety and comfort. Her ability to gracefully step away from the marriage without resistance ensured that she was not seen as a threat, unlike Anne Boleyn, whose refusal to back down led to her execution. Both women also shared the experience of being misjudged by Henry VIII, though in vastly different ways. Anne Boleyn had spent years as the object of Henry's obsessive desire, only to have that love turn to hatred when she failed to give him a male heir. His passion for her had driven him to extreme lengths, defying the Pope, reshaping England's religious landscape, and defying those who had opposed the marriage. But as soon as Anne became a liability rather than an asset, Henry discarded her with the same intensity with which he had once pursued her. Anne of Cleves, in contrast, was rejected from the moment Henry met her. He had built an image of her in his mind based on the flattering portrait painted by Hans Holbein, only to be disappointed when he saw her in person. Whether Anne was truly unattractive or simply not to Henry's taste is still debated, but what is clear is that Henry's swift disinterest sealed her fate before she even had a chance to prove herself. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who had spent years winning Henry's heart, Anne of Cleves had lost before she even began. Yet, perhaps the most significant parallel between the two women was the way they influenced Elizabeth I's reign. Anne Boleyn's influence on her daughter Elizabeth is undeniable. Elizabeth inherited her mother's intelligence, political savvy, and determination. But Anne of Cleves, though she had no direct blood connection to Elizabeth, also played a quiet yet important role in shaping the future queen's early life. After her annulment, Anne of Cleves remained in England, maintaining a cordial relationship with Henry and his children. She was one of the few figures in Elizabeth's youth who had no reason to see her as a threat. While others at court were constantly maneuvering for power, Anne of Cleves had no ambitions beyond securing her own stability. This made her a rare, neutral presence in the lives of Henry's children. Furthermore, Elizabeth would have been acutely aware of how Anne of Cleves had outlived and outmaneuvered Henry VIII. Unlike Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, who had been executed for failing to meet Henry's expectations, Anne of Cleves had navigated the dangerous waters of Tudor politics with quiet strategy. She had proven that survival was not just about power, but about knowing when to step away from the game. It is not unreasonable to think that Elizabeth, a master of political survival herself, might have drawn lessons from the way Anne of Cleves handled her precarious position. Despite these parallels, there was one critical difference between Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves: their ultimate legacies. Anne Boleyn was a queen who changed the course of history, a woman whose influence extended beyond her own lifetime and directly shaped England's future. Her story was dramatic, tragic, and unforgettable. Anne of Cleves, by contrast, became a queen in name only, remembered not for political upheaval but for her ability to walk away from danger unscathed. And yet, both of them, one through her ambition, the other through her survival, demonstrated that a woman's fate in Henry's court was never entirely in her own hands. No matter how intelligent, beautiful, or strategic she was ultimately at the mercy of Henry's unpredictable will. Anne Boleyn had sought power and paid for it with her life. Anne of Cleves had relinquished power and lived. Their stories, intertwined yet opposite, serve as two sides of the same coin, a reminder of the perilous nature of Henry VIII's court and the unpredictable fate of those who dared to become his queen. Part 8. Anne of Cleves' role in Elizabeth I's England. By the time Elizabeth I ascended to the throne in 1558, Anne of Cleves had been living in England for nearly 2 decades. Though her official role had long since ended with the annulment of her marriage to Henry VIII, she remained a quiet but enduring presence in Tudor society. Unlike Henry's other wives, most of whom had met tragic ends, and had not only survived but had managed to retain a measure of status and dignity. But what was her place in England during Elizabeth's reign, and how did she fit into the complex political landscape of the new Queen's court? Anne of Cleves had been one of the few foreign queens to remain in England after her marriage to Henry VIII ended. While other royal women, such as Catherine of Aragon's Spanish attendants or Anne Boleyn's French connections, were either expelled or chose to leave, Anne of Cleves made the decision to stay. It was a choice that, whether by design or circumstance, would allow her to witness one of the most remarkable transitions in English history. During the reign of Mary I, Elizabeth had lived under constant suspicion. As the Protestant daughter of Anne Boleyn, she was an ever-present threat to Mary's Catholic rule. The court was filled with spies, and Elizabeth was watched closely. Yet, during these tumultuous years, Anne of Cleves was one of the few figures who had no reason to involve herself in courtly plots. She was neither a Catholic zealot nor a Protestant radical. Her political neutrality allowed her to remain in favor regardless of who was on the throne. This neutrality may have been one reason why Anne of Cleves was in a unique position when Elizabeth I became queen. While she had never held any direct political power, she had lived through the most critical decades of the Tudor dynasty. She had seen Henry VIII's many marriages, the rise and fall of powerful figures like Thomas Cromwell, and the religious transformations that had swept England. Unlike many members of Elizabeth's court, who were either new to power or had shifting allegiances, Anne of Cleves had been a silent witness to it all. Though there is little direct evidence of close contact between Anne of Cleves and Elizabeth I, it is unlikely that the new queen would have ignored her stepmother's presence. Elizabeth had grown up knowing who Anne was, understanding that she was the only one of her father's former wives still living. This alone would have set Anne apart in Elizabeth's mind. Elizabeth was also a pragmatic ruler, and she understood the value of keeping figures like Anne of Cleves within her sphere of influence. While Anne no longer held any official role in court, she remained a highly respected figure, one whose past marriage to Henry VIII still carried symbolic weight. She had been a Tudor queen, even if only briefly, and in a monarchy that relied heavily on perception, this fact alone gave her a certain status. There were practical reasons for Elizabeth to maintain ties with Anne of Cleves as well. Though Anne had been out of the European political scene for years, her connections to the German Protestant states had never completely faded. With England now firmly in Protestant hands under Elizabeth, those connections could be useful. If Elizabeth ever needed to strengthen diplomatic ties with Protestant Europe, Anne of Cleves, who had once been the face of an Anglo-German alliance, could serve as a quiet but valuable link. Additionally, Anne's presence served as a living reminder of Henry VIII's reign and the lessons it held. Elizabeth had spent much of her life studying the fates of her father's wives. She had seen how her mother and Boleyn had risen and fallen in dramatic fashion. She had witnessed how Catherine Howard had been destroyed by reckless ambition. And she had observed how Anne of Cleves had survived by yielding, by refusing to fight battles she could not win. Elizabeth's own strategy as queen, her careful avoidance of marriage, her ability to maneuver through dangerous political waters, and her understanding of when to assert authority and when to step back, bore remarkable similarities to Anne of Cleves' approach to life in Henry's court. Though Elizabeth was far more powerful than Anne had ever been, she had learned one of the most valuable lessons from her stepmother's example. Sometimes survival was the greatest victory of all. Despite these subtle connections, Anne of Cleves' final years were not entirely smooth. As the Tudor court moved forward under Elizabeth, Anne's position grew increasingly uncertain. She had been granted a generous income after her annulment, but as time passed, she became less of a priority for the crown. The lands and wealth she had been given under Henry VIII were gradually reduced, and by the later years of Mary I's reign, Anne had been forced to petition the crown for financial support. When Elizabeth came to power, there was no immediate restoration of Anne's former privileges. Though Elizabeth did not mistreat her, she also did not elevate her status. Anne was, by this time, an aging foreigner who held no real political power. Her survival had been remarkable, but there was little place for her in Elizabeth's new government. Anne of Cleves spent her final years at Chelsea Old Manor, the same residence where Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's last wife, had died. It was a fitting location. Chelsea had often been a home for the discarded women of Henry's court, a place of quiet retreat for those who had once been at the center of royal intrigue, and lived there in relative peace, away from the dangers of political ambition that had claimed so many others. On July 16, 1557, Anne of Cleves passed away at the age of 41. She was the only one of Henry VIII's wives to be buried in Westminster Abbey, an honor that reflected her continued status as a member of the royal family, even in death. Though she had never been a queen in the traditional sense, she was still recognized as a woman who had played a role in England's history. Her legacy in Elizabeth's England was one of quiet endurance. She had never sought to rule, never tried to seize power, and never allowed herself to be caught in the deadly politics of the Tudor court. And yet, she had remained standing when so many others had fallen. Elizabeth I, for all her brilliance and ambition, was a queen who understood the value of survival above all else. Perhaps in some unspoken way, she saw in Anne of Cleves not just a former stepmother, but a woman who had mastered the one skill that mattered most in Henry VIII's world, the ability to outlive him. Part 9. The Forgotten Queens, and Boleyn and Anne of Cleves in popular memory. The legacies of Boleyn and Anne of Cleves have taken on vastly different forms over the centuries. One is remembered as one of the most famous queens in English history, a woman whose rise and fall shaped the very foundations of England's religious and political identity. The other remains a lesser-known figure, often reduced to the queen who was rejected by Henry VIII before their marriage had even truly begun. But what do these differing legacies tell us about how history remembers women, particularly those who were once at the mercy of a king's favor? How have Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves been remembered, and how has time altered their place in the collective imagination? Anne Boleyn's reputation was shaped almost immediately after her execution. Though Henry VIII worked tirelessly to erase her from memory, destroying her portraits, removing her emblems, and attempting to blacken her name, her story was too dramatic, too compelling, to be forgotten. Within a generation, she had transformed from a disgraced queen to a tragic figure, a woman who had suffered at the hands of a tyrannical husband. Her legacy became even more powerful once Elizabeth I took the throne. As Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn was no longer just a fallen queen. She was the woman who had given birth to one of England's greatest monarchs. Under Elizabeth's rule, Anne's reputation was carefully rehabilitated. While Elizabeth did not openly discuss her mother, she surrounded herself with former Boleyn allies and ensured that Anne's name was subtly honored. By the time Elizabeth's reign ended, Anne Boleyn had been transformed into a symbol of Protestantism, martyrdom, and political intrigue. Centuries later, Anne Boleyn became one of the most studied and romanticized figures in British history. Historians, novelists, and playwrights alike have explored her life in extraordinary detail. She has been portrayed as a cunning political player, an innocent victim, a Protestant heroine, and even a feminist icon. Each generation has reinterpreted Anne Boleyn, making her one of the most enduring figures of the Tudor period. Anne of Cleves, on the other hand, has remained largely in the background of history. Unlike Anne Boleyn, she left no dramatic downfall, no fiery speeches, no powerful legacy that shaped the direction of a nation. Instead, her legacy has often been reduced to a single, oversimplified moment: Henry VIII's disappointment upon meeting her. The infamous story of Henry's reaction to Anne of Cleves, his alleged disgust and the claim that he found her unattractive, has overshadowed everything else about her. The idea that she was the ugly wife has persisted for centuries, despite the lack of evidence that she was anything other than an ordinary noblewoman. Her intelligence, adaptability, and ability to outlive Henry VIII have often been ignored in favor of a narrative that focuses on her supposed shortcomings as a wife. Yet, for those who look beyond the surface, Anne of Cleves' story is far more interesting than the way she has been remembered. She was the only one of Henry VIII's wives to emerge from the marriage with her life, her status, and a comfortable existence. She avoided the tragedies that befell Catherine Howard and Anne Boleyn. She was the only one of Henry's wives who managed to maintain a respectful relationship with him after their marriage ended. Over time, some historians and writers have begun to re-evaluate Anne of Cleves' legacy. In recent years, there has been a growing recognition that she was not simply a discarded wife, but rather a woman who skillfully navigated one of the most dangerous courts in history. Her ability to negotiate her annulment without scandal, to secure wealth and independence, and to maintain a respected position in England has led to a reconsideration of her place in Tudor history. Even in popular culture, Anne of Cleves has seen something of a revival. While she has never reached the legendary status of Anne Boleyn, she has begun to appear more frequently in historical novels, television adaptations, and even stage productions. Writers have started to explore her life beyond the infamous rejection by Henry VIII, showing her as a pragmatic survivor rather than a mere footnote in Tudor history. But the contrast between Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves in popular memory raises an important question. Why do some queens become legends while others are forgotten? Part of the answer lies in the nature of their stories. Anne Boleyn's life was full of drama: her rise from a minor noblewoman to queen, her passionate courtship with Henry, her execution on charges of adultery and treason. It was the perfect material for history books, plays, and later, films and television dramas. Anne of Cleves, by contrast, did not have a tragic downfall. She was not executed, she did not have a dramatic love affair, and she did not play a key role in political or religious upheaval. Instead, her story was one of quiet endurance, of adapting to her circumstances rather than fighting against them. This difference in narrative impact has shaped how both queens are remembered. Tragic figures like Anne Boleyn capture the imagination in a way that survivors like Anne of Cleves often do not. And yet, survival in Henry VIII's court was no small achievement. Perhaps, in the long run, Anne of Cleves' quiet triumph was just as remarkable as Anne Boleyn's dramatic tragedy. Today, as historians continue to uncover new details about both women, their legacies are still evolving. Anne Boleyn remains one of the most studied women in British history, her every action analyzed and debated. But Anne of Cleves is beginning to be recognized not just as the Queen Henry rejected, but as a woman who successfully outmaneuvered one of the most dangerous kings in history. Their stories, though vastly different, remain interconnected. One queen changed England's history through her ambition, her passion, and her ultimate downfall. The other changed her own fate through careful negotiation, strategic retreat, and a keen understanding of how to survive in a world where so many others perished. Both Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves were queens who, in their own ways, defied expectations. One was remembered as a legend. The other is finally being remembered as more than just a discarded bride. Part 10. The influence of Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves on modern perceptions of queenship. The way history remembers queens is often shaped by the political and cultural lens of the time. Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves, though vastly different in their experiences and historical impact, have each contributed to evolving ideas of what it means to be a queen. Their stories have influenced how later generations perceive royal women, not just in Tudor England, but in monarchy as a whole. Anne Boleyn, as the more famous of the two, has long been seen as a transformative figure in the history of queenship. Her marriage to Henry VIII was not merely a royal union, it was the catalyst for the English Reformation, an event that fundamentally altered the relationship between the monarchy and the Church. In many ways, Anne was the first English queen to wield real influence over religious and political matters, setting a precedent for future consorts who wished to be more than just ceremonial figures. Before Anne Boleyn, English queens had traditionally been seen as diplomatic tools, used to forge alliances between kingdoms. Their primary roles were to produce heirs, support their husbands, and remain politically neutral. But Anne changed that. She was not just Henry VIII's wife, she was a key figure in his break from Rome, the mother of a future queen, and a woman whose ambition shaped the very structure of English governance. This model of queenship, a woman who was politically astute, ambitious, and deeply involved in affairs of state, became increasingly relevant in later centuries. Elizabeth I, Anne's daughter, would embody many of these qualities, proving that a woman could rule in her own right. Even later queens, such as Victoria and Elizabeth II, have been compared to Anne Boleyn in terms of their ability to navigate the complexities of power while maintaining a strong and independent image. But Anne Boleyn's story also carried a cautionary element. Her downfall served as a stark warning about the dangers of ambition in a male-dominated world. Future queens would learn that influence was a double-edged sword. Too much power, too much confidence, could lead to destruction. Even in modern discussions about women in leadership, Anne's fate is often invoked as an example of how society punishes ambitious women more harshly than their male counterparts. Anne of Cleves, on the other hand, represents a different kind of queenship, one based not on political influence, but on survival. While she did not hold the same power as Anne Boleyn, her story challenges the idea that a queen must be either a ruler or a victim. She was neither. Instead, she demonstrated that adaptability, intelligence, and the ability to navigate a difficult political landscape were just as important as direct influence. Anne of Cleves' story resonates particularly in modern discussions about royal duty versus personal agency. Unlike Henry VIII's other wives, she did not fight to maintain her position as queen, nor did she rebel against the system that placed her there. Instead, she negotiated her own fate, securing a future that allowed her to live comfortably and independently. In doing so, she subverted the expectation that a woman's worth was tied solely to her marriage and status as a royal consort. Her legacy has influenced modern perceptions of queenship in a quieter way than Anne Boleyn's, but it is no less significant. Today, when royal women such as Meghan Markle or Queen Letizia of Spain choose to step back from traditional roles or redefine their positions, they are often compared to historical figures like Anne of Cleves. She represents a different model of success, one where stepping away from the throne does not mean failure, but rather a different kind of triumph. The contrast between Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves highlights the evolving nature of queenship. In earlier centuries, the ideal queen was expected to be passive, obedient, and politically neutral. Anne Boleyn shattered that expectation, proving that a queen could be a powerful force in shaping a nation. Anne of Cleves, in turn, demonstrated that queenship was not just about power, it was also about survival, negotiation, and knowing when to retreat in order to secure one's own future. Both of their stories continue to inform modern discussions about women in leadership. Anne Boleyn is often invoked in debates about women's ambition and the challenges of navigating a male-dominated world. Anne of Cleves, meanwhile, serves as a reminder that success is not always about power. Sometimes, it is about playing the long game, knowing when to step back, and ensuring one's survival in an unforgiving system. In the modern British monarchy, echoes of Anne Boleyn's and Anne of Cleves' influence can still be seen. Queen Elizabeth II, for instance, balanced elements of both women's approaches. She maintained the dignity and endurance of Anne of Cleves while also asserting her authority in ways that recalled Anne Boleyn's determination. Similarly, contemporary royal women, from Catherine, Princess of Wales, to Queen Maxima of the Netherlands, continue to navigate the delicate balance between public duty and personal autonomy. The way these two Annes are remembered also speaks to the broader issue of how history chooses its heroines. Anne Boleyn, with her dramatic rise and fall, fits neatly into the narrative of a tragic yet influential queen. Anne of Cleves, with her quieter, more pragmatic success, has often been overlooked. Yet, in many ways, her approach to queenship was just as impactful. It demonstrated that intelligence and adaptability were just as valuable as power and ambition. As modern society continues to reassess the roles of women in positions of leadership, both Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves offer lessons that remain relevant. One teaches the risks and rewards of challenging the system. The other teaches the power of knowing when to yield. Together, their legacies shape a more nuanced understanding of queenship, one that recognizes that there is no single path to success. Part 11. The lasting political and cultural impact of Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves. The impact of Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves extends far beyond their lifetimes. Though they lived in a world where women were often seen as secondary to the men who ruled, their influence rippled through English politics, culture, and even the broader European landscape. Their legacies are not merely footnotes in Tudor history. They are essential pieces of a larger story about power, religion, and the role of women in shaping the course of nations. Anne Boleyn's political impact is undeniable. She was the catalyst for one of the most significant religious shifts in European history, the English Reformation. Before Anne, Henry VIII had been a staunch Catholic, defending the Church against Protestant reforms. But Anne's presence in his life, combined with her refusal to become his mistress, forced Henry to challenge the authority of the Pope. Their marriage directly led to England's break from Rome, the establishment of the Church of England, and the reshaping of religious authority within the kingdom. Even after her execution, Anne's influence continued to be felt. The Protestant cause in England remained strong, and when her daughter, Elizabeth I, ascended the throne, Anne's vision of a Protestant England became a reality. Elizabeth's long and stable reign solidified England as a Protestant nation, further distancing it from the influence of the Catholic Church. In this sense, Anne Boleyn's impact was not only immediate but also long-lasting. Her determination and ambition laid the groundwork for a religious transformation that would define England for centuries. beyond religion, and Boleyn's cultural influence was profound. She set new standards for the role of a queen, demonstrating that a consort could be an intellectual, politically engaged, and influential figure. Her sharp wit, education, and interest in reform reshaped expectations for future queens. No longer were they expected to be passive figures in the background. They could be active participants in shaping policy and influencing the direction of the monarchy. Anne of Cleves, though less politically active than Anne Boleyn, also left an important mark on England. Her greatest political achievement was in how she managed her exit from Henry VIII's court. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, who fought tirelessly and ultimately unsuccessfully to retain her status as queen, Anne of Cleves understood the dangers of defying Henry. Rather than resisting, she negotiated an annulment that allowed her to retain wealth, security, and a respected position in English society. In doing so, Anne of Cleves set a precedent for peaceful diplomatic solutions to royal conflicts. Her handling of the annulment demonstrated that a queen could preserve her dignity and influence even without a crown. This lesson was not lost on later queens and royal women who found themselves in precarious political positions. Anne of Cleves' story became an example of how intelligence, adaptability, and a keen understanding of power dynamics could ensure survival in a court known for its ruthlessness. Her impact extended beyond just political maneuvering. Anne of Cleves' arrival in England marked a significant moment in Anglo-German relations. As a member of the powerful House of La Marck, she represented one of the few instances of an English king seeking an alliance with a Protestant German state. Though her marriage to Henry VIII ultimately failed, it underscored England's growing interest in strengthening ties with Protestant Europe rather than remaining aligned solely with Catholic powers like Spain and France. In cultural memory, both Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves have shaped perceptions of queenship and female influence. Anne Boleyn is often remembered as a tragic figure, a woman whose ambition led to her downfall but whose legacy reshaped England. She has been the subject of countless books, plays, films, and television series, each offering new interpretations of her life and impact. Her story has been woven into discussions about female power, ambition, and the consequences of challenging established norms. Anne of Cleves, on the other hand, has been remembered in a quieter but equally significant way. For centuries, she was reduced to the queen Henry found unattractive, but recent historical re-evaluations have painted a more complex picture. She is now seen as a woman who successfully navigated one of the most dangerous courts in history, securing a future that was far better than the fate suffered by many of Henry's other wives. Her legacy is one of resilience, pragmatism, and the ability to redefine success on her own terms. The contrast between these two women highlights different ways in which queens could exert influence. Anne Boleyn's approach was bold, direct, and revolutionary. She challenged the existing order and reshaped the course of English history. Anne of Cleves, by contrast, demonstrated the power of subtlety, negotiation, and self-preservation. Both approaches were effective in their own ways, shaping how later queens and royal women navigated power structures. Even beyond the Tudor period, their legacies continued to influence political thought. The idea of a queen as an active political figure, first introduced by Anne Boleyn, was carried forward into the reigns of queens like Elizabeth I, Victoria, and even modern royal women. Anne of Cleves' model of strategic retreat, meanwhile, has been reflected in the choices of royal women who have stepped back from their roles while maintaining influence, such as Wallis Simpson and, more recently, Meghan Markle. Their impact is not limited to England alone. The stories of Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves resonate internationally as examples of how women in positions of power must navigate ambition, expectation, and survival. Whether through active political engagement or careful negotiation, their legacies offer timeless lessons on leadership, strategy, and resilience. As their stories continue to be explored in historical research, literature, and media, the significance of their influence becomes even clearer. They were not just wives of Henry VIII, they were key players in a broader political and cultural transformation. Their lives shaped England's religious landscape, redefined expectations for queenship, and provided lasting insights into the complexities of power. Ultimately, the legacies of Boleyn and Anne of Cleves are reminders that influence comes in many forms. Some wield power through direct action, reshaping the course of history. Others secure their place through careful strategy, ensuring that their story does not end in tragedy. Both are equally significant, proving that there is no single path to lasting impact. Part 12. The Final Reflection. What the lives of Boleyn and Anne of Cleves teach us today. The stories of Boleyn and Anne of Cleves are more than just historical accounts of two queens who married the same king. They are narratives filled with lessons about power, ambition, resilience, and the unpredictable nature of fate. Though they lived nearly 5 centuries ago, their experiences continue to hold relevance, offering insights into leadership, survival, and the challenges faced by women who seek to navigate complex political and social structures. Anne Boleyn's legacy is one of transformation. She did not accept the traditional role of a queen consort as merely a silent supporter of the king. Instead, she saw herself as an equal partner in the shaping of England's future. Her intelligence, ambition, and influence were undeniable, and in the end, they changed the country in ways no one could have predicted. Her story serves as a reminder that innovation and boldness often come at great risk, but they can also lead to lasting change. At the same time, Anne Boleyn's downfall illustrates the perils of standing too boldly against the tide. The very qualities that made her extraordinary, her confidence, outspokenness, and refusal to conform, were the same qualities that led to her execution. Her fate demonstrates the double standard faced by powerful women throughout history. While men were celebrated for their ambition and political cunning, women who exhibited the same traits were often vilified or punished. Even in today's world, discussions about women in leadership often echo the challenges Anne Boleyn faced. In contrast, Anne of Cleves represents a different kind of strength. Unlike Anne Boleyn, she did not seek to challenge the political or religious order. Instead, she mastered the art of survival, demonstrating that success does not always come from direct confrontation. Her ability to adapt to changing circumstances ensured her security and allowed her to maintain a level of freedom and respect that few of Henry VIII's wives enjoyed. She teaches us that sometimes, walking away from a battle is the smartest choice one can make. Her story also challenges traditional ideas about failure. Though her marriage to Henry VIII was short-lived, Anne of Cleves ultimately emerged in a stronger position than many of Henry's other wives. She lived comfortably, avoided scandal, and remained on good terms with the king, even as others lost their heads. In a world that often measures success by external achievements, Anne of Cleves reminds us that true success can also be found in self-preservation and personal happiness. Together, Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves provide two contrasting models of navigating power and influence. One through ambition and direct engagement, the other through adaptability and strategic retreat. Neither approach is inherently superior. Both were shaped by the circumstances of their time and the personalities of the women themselves. Their lives also serve as a reflection on the unpredictability of fate. Anne Boleyn entered Henry VIII's court as a woman who seemed destined for greatness. She was the king's great love, the mother of his heir, and the queen who changed the course of English history. Yet, within a few short years, she was executed on the very grounds where she once walked as the most powerful woman in England. Anne of Cleves, by contrast, came to England as an outsider, knowing little of the man she was meant to marry. Within 6 months, her marriage was over, and it seemed as though she had been cast aside. Yet, she outlived Henry VIII and his other wives, ultimately securing a peaceful and comfortable existence that many queens could only dream of. Their stories remind us that power is fleeting, and fortunes can change in an instant. Modern discussions about women, power, and resilience continue to be shaped by historical figures like Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves. Their experiences resonate not only in royal history but in broader discussions about leadership, ambition, and the cost of challenging societal expectations. Even today, women in politics, business, and other high-profile positions face many of the same struggles, whether it is the scrutiny of their personal lives, the pressure to conform, or the consequences of ambition in a world that still holds different standards for men and women. And Boleyn's story reminds us of the courage it takes to stand up for one's beliefs, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. Her legacy is a testament to the fact that change often comes at a price, but that those who dare to challenge the status quo can leave a lasting impact. Anne of Cleves' story, on the other hand, teaches us the importance of adaptability. She did not fight for power in the way Anne Boleyn did, but she found ways to secure her place in history without resorting to confrontation. Her life stands as an example that stepping away from a battle does not always mean losing. It can sometimes be the key to long-term survival. Their contrasting lives also highlight the different ways in which women have historically exercised agency. Some have fought boldly for change, challenging the systems that sought to confine them. Others have worked within those systems, finding ways to secure stability and independence despite the odds. Both paths require strength, intelligence, and resilience. As history continues to reassess the roles of women in power, both Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves remain essential figures in understanding the complexities of leadership, ambition, and survival. Their stories remind us that there is no single way to make an impact. Some rise through challenge and reform. Others succeed through careful navigation of the structures around them. Both approaches shape the world in meaningful ways. Their legacies endure not only in history books but in the very fabric of how we perceive female power today. Whether in government, business, or cultural leadership, the lessons of Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves continue to resonate. They show us that influence comes in many forms, that success is not always defined by a title, and that the choices we make, whether bold or cautious, can have lasting consequences. In the end, the stories of these two queens teach us that power is not just about ruling, it is about shaping the world in ways that endure far beyond one's own lifetime. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves left lasting legacies, each shaping England in unique ways. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more captivating stories from the past. See you next time.